Welcome to Fast Keto. I'm your host, Ketogenic Girl. Hey guys, I am so thrilled to have Amy Berger joining us today. She is a low carb and keto nutritionist, NTP. She has her MS, CNS, is a USAF veteran, and she specializes in using low carbohydrate nutrition to help people reclaim their vitality through eating delicious foods and showing people that getting and staying well doesn't require starvation, deprivation, or living at the gym. She has a great blog, which is toitnutrition.com, where she writes about a wide range of health and nutrition related topics. She blogs all about insulin, metabolism, weight loss, thyroid function, and more. And also she wrote an incredible book called The Alzheimer's Antidote, using a low carb, high fat diet to fight Alzheimer's disease, memory loss, and cognitive decline. So I am so thrilled to have Amy joining us today. If you haven't checked out my cookbook yet, it is called Keto Essentials on Amazon, and it is currently 42% off on Amazon. It has over 150 of my favorite keto recipes, all of the most delicious comfort foods that I have made into keto treats, everything from fettuccine alfredo, keto pad thai, my spinach and artichoke dip, cheesecake, brownies, decadent, delicious, healing, and healthy recipes to get you started on keto. And I make them all super simple. All the ingredients you can find at any supermarket. I don't use a lot of hard to find ingredients. I like to be able to make these recipes at using ingredients from any supermarket, any grocery store. And there are a few keto products in there that you might want to try at some point, like those weird noodles. But you know what? You can make all keto foods and recipes from my book without having to get any rare and hard to find ingredients. It is called Keto Essentials. It's on Amazon for 42% off. Go and get yourself a copy and get a copy for everyone you know, because hey, keto is amazing and you know it is. So go check it out, and hope you enjoyed today's episode. A few disclaimers. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice, as I am not a qualified healthcare provider. The information presented on this podcast is for educational purposes only. Ketogenic Girl is not qualified to provide medical advice. Consult your own physician for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to this podcast. Prior to beginning a ketogenic diet, you should undergo a full health screening with your physician to confirm that a keto diet is suitable for you and to rule out any conditions or contraindications that may pose risks or that are incompatible with the ketogenic diet. A keto diet may or may not be appropriate for you if you have any kind of health condition, whether known to you or unknown. So you must consult your physician to find this out. Anyone under the age of 18 should consult with their physician and their parents or legal guardian. Welcome, Amy.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks so much. It's, I think you're on the East Coast. Am I correct that you're in, is it Virginia, possibly?
Yep, yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad to have you joining us today. And just to start out, for anyone who may not be familiar with you or your work, maybe you could start out just by telling us a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so I am a low carb and ketogenic oriented nutritionist, although, I'm open to other ways of eating. I don't limit myself to that. It just depends on what the client wants to do and what their goals are. But I am probably not unlike a lot of your audience in that I spent most of my young adult life doing what I thought were all the right things to get healthy and to lose some weight. And joke was on me. It didn't work. The more I exercised, the less I ate, the worse I felt, and the more weight I gained, actually. And unfortunately, I did what so many of us do. I blamed myself. I internalized a lot of that. I felt like a failure. I felt all the guilt and the shame. And thank goodness, one day I stumbled upon an old copy of the Atkins diet book. And literally it was serendipity. My mother had gotten a copy of it at a yard sale, believe it or not. And I read it and it just made sense. It was so different from what I was used to. Here he was talking about eating steak and cheese and butter and heavy cream, and it was so scary, but I had done it the other way for so long and gotten nowhere that I said, I have nothing to lose. I might as well try this. And lo and behold, it worked. And now, many years later, I've since gotten a master's in nutrition and I have some formal training. So I try to help others discover how simple this all is and how easy and fun and delicious, because you get to eat some of the most decadent foods while being in the best health of your life.
I love that. And I always find that so much of eating this way is so decadent and it's so healthy at the same time. And we have come to think and be trained of decadence as not healthy, as somehow bad for us. And yet with keto, the more decadent sometimes, the better it is for you. It's amazing, all those lush, healthy fats and wonderful things. It's funny. I heard you say on an interview that your favorite keto food is mayo. And that's my favorite keto food. When people ask me on interviews, it's always mayonnaise.
I don't know that it's my favorite, but is definitely, I hate this phrase, but it's a trigger food. And I actually am not allowed to have it in my house because I will go crazy on that. So
it's good to know what those foods are. I know for me, it's coconut butter, but mayonnaise is just, it's such a great, addition to just about everything.
Yeah, well, and I also, because this is the Ketogenic Girl podcast, it's interesting, the decadent food, it's not all decadent. Certainly on low carb and keto, you can have salad and you can have cucumbers and things like that. But I honestly think that women, young women in particular, have been conditioned to think that chowing down on a big juicy steak is unfeminine or it's masculine and that women shouldn't have a big fatty pork chop. And I would love to see that sort of cultural conditioning just go away, because I do get a lot of clients that even if they're eating low carb or keto, they're still not really eating enough of those foods that are really the most nutrient dense foods. And they're loaded with iron and zinc and B12. And I just think that women are still a little bit afraid of those sort of stereotypically male kind of foods.
I love that. I've never thought of it that way before. And it's funny because, I've just been doing this carnivore trial for the last 30 days. And
oh, you are? Interesting. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I've been doing it to learn things. And I've had so many men come in, obviously a lot of men follow it and have tried it, but so many women come out and they're like, it's so interesting to see a woman doing carnivore because it's unusual. And I didn't think about it that way, that it is kind of more of a masculine, and less feminine thing to be gouging, or not gouging, but to be eating, all this meat and steak. It does, feel unfeminine. Most of how I eat now is like that. I never thought about it that way. It's very interesting.
Well, what's really fascinating about it is we feel like it's unfeminine because we've just been culturally conditioned that way. But it's actually, if anything, women of reproductive age need those foods even more than men do. We need the iron. We need the vitamin A. We need all that stuff that we just tend to really skimp on. And if anyone out there has this kind of feeling, just don't be afraid. If you're hungry, you eat. And if you want a steak, you eat that steak and you enjoy it.
Maybe that's why, part of the reason women have we get we almost not love or worship keto, but you get really excited about it. And it's almost like it gives you this permission to eat all these foods, healthy fats and steaks and things that we traditionally have not been programmed, but kind of had veered away from because, of our diet culture and what media tells us is the best way to lose weight and all these things. It's definitely more salad oriented and not, mayo and steak oriented.
Yes, correct. Definitely.
I really love your message, Amy. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show, it's not just because I'm biased, but we do think a lot alike in a lot of ways with regards to making keto as simple as possible, not overcomplicating it, and also with regards to not overdoing the fat. So in your opinion, how do you make keto as easy as possible? And should we emphasize high fat or controlling carbs?
Oh, good question. So everything really depends on what somebody's looking to accomplish, because you can use a low carb or ketogenic diet for any number of goals. When we first started recording, I did mention that I personally started low carbing because of fat loss, but over the years that I've learned much more about it, you come to see what this diet is capable of doing. And it's almost like weight loss is the least impressive and least important thing it can do. I mean, you can control your blood sugar, you can control seizures, all kinds of things. So the composition of any low carb or keto diet depends on what the person in question is trying to use the diet for. Most of the clients who come to me do want fat loss. That is the main thing they come to me for. And I have really been trying to emphasize low carb over ketogenic, because a ketogenic diet is a low carb diet. It's just more strict. It's a little more extreme. And when I say low carb, people really get the message that keeping carbs low is the far more important aspect of this way of eating rather than adding more fat. The fat burning doesn't happen because you eat more fat. It happens because you eat fewer carbs. If fat burning happened when you ate more fat, you could just eat 2 bagels, and as long as you had a ton of cream cheese and butter on them, you would lose weight. But I think we all know it doesn't work that way. What you have to do
We've all been there.
you have to not have the 2 bagels. So if somebody's main goal is fat loss, when I talk to them about emphasizing the low carb aspect over the high fat aspect, I do try to emphasize that I'm not trying to make them afraid of fat. I don't want to go too far in the other direction, but I just see too many people afraid of protein. And because they're afraid of protein, they eat extra fat. If they're hungry, instead of having an extra piece of chicken or 2 extra eggs, they'll have 2 fat bombs or a fatty coffee. And it's just not working out so well for people.
Well, I think it's just exactly what you're saying in that low carb. It says so right there in the name. It's just low carb. Those 2 words say everything, and it just makes it as straightforward as possible. Now, how do you make keto as easy as possible for people, aside from, the language? If someone is overwhelmed by all the information out there and all the ketones and the levels and the testing and the getting the fats high enough, how do you just make it as easy as possible for people to get started?
Yeah, so it's actually the same answer. I emphasize a very, very low carbohydrate intake rather than being in ketosis, because you don't need to be in a state of high ketosis in order to lose body fat or to get most of the other metabolic benefits. Like if someone has a neurological disorder or some other severe medical condition that they're trying to use keto as an adjunct therapy for, that's different. They may actually need to be in a higher state of ketosis. Most people who are just looking to lose body fat or just have overall health and wellness don't need to make themselves crazy with that. For some people, especially if they're brand new, but even if they've been doing this for a while, some people find this diet very easy, very fun, and there's no problem. Some people really struggle with it. And if you're already struggling with it, why add the extra layer of complexity of weighing everything and measuring and tracking your ketones and doing all this when the fact is people's bodies just really vary? And it's not the case that it's a mathematical formula where if you eat exactly this much fat and this much protein and this much carb, you will have a ketone level of this. And so people get really worried or afraid and a lot of self-doubt when they don't see high ketones. And high ketones don't cause faster or greater fat loss. If people take away nothing else from this podcast, take away that. You don't have to chase very high ketones. So mainly when people are new, I start them out. I don't ask them to weigh or measure anything. I don't ask them to test their sugar or their ketones. I mean, if they're diabetic, they may want to test their sugar anyway, and just do the diet for a couple of weeks. If they're not getting the results they want, then I might encourage them to start tracking because maybe they are doing something that's getting in the way and they don't realize it. But most people, especially when they're new, just don't really have to make themselves crazy over all that stuff. The single most important thing to do is to keep your carb intake very, very low.
So would you say the most powerful step that someone can do is reducing their carb intake, reducing their sugar intake?
Yeah, I mean that's what starts the ketogenic process is when the body doesn't have enough carbohydrate coming in. So, I mean, the fact is, we all know plenty of people who don't go on a ketogenic diet, don't go on a low carb diet. Maybe when I was in the military a long time ago, I knew guys that all they had to do was stop drinking beer and they could lose 20 pounds. They didn't, they were still eating burgers with buns, still eating the potatoes and the fries, and they would lose weight. So not everybody needs to have such a dramatic carbohydrate restriction, but certainly that is what makes this diet work. So I do think that's the most important thing. Of course, there's other aspects to the diet, but that's what defines a low carb or ketogenic diet is a very low carb intake.
Right. Now, in which cases would you recommend to someone that they be more strict and kind of try to do more of a ketogenic approach? Because there are studies out there that show that there's actually, a metabolic switch that happens once you get to around like the 30 gram or so and below. level of carb intake where you go into ketosis? Like, are there certain people where you say, I mean, I always joke that I look at a sweet potato and I gain weight. Like for me, keto was the thing that worked for me. I had to get to that level of restriction. For me, it's more about controlling carbs. So in what kind of situations do you recommend people kind of go more on that, really controlling the carbs or going more for ketosis?
Definitely people who are more athletic and very active tend to have a higher carb tolerance, especially if it's somebody that has no history or no signs and symptoms of any metabolic problem, no type 2 diabetes, no chronically high insulin. If they're healthy and they've always been healthy and they want to stay healthy, a lot of those people can do just fine with more of like a paleo diet. And paleo is not low or high carb by definition. It's just more unprocessed whole foods, but it tends to be lower carb than a normal standard Western diet just because they're not eating grain, they're not eating sugar, but they may still be eating whole fruit and tubers and things like that. But when I say that not everybody needs to be in ketosis, I actually didn't really mean that people don't do best at 20 or 30 grams of carbs. I meant more that they don't have to make themselves crazy over measuring the ketones. Because here's the thing, you and I and 100 other people out there could eat the exact same food, the exact same amount of carbohydrate, and our ketone levels will be very different. I could be at 0.1, you could be at 2.5. People's bodies just really vary in their natural tendency to generate high ketones unless they're fasting or doing some other intervention to specifically have higher ketones. Most people, especially when they're new, I do recommend starting with something like an Atkins induction, which is 20 grams of carbs a day. I mean, it's definitely a ketogenic state. What I guess the difference is the amount of carbohydrate that you would expect to result in a high ketone level versus the actual ketone level that results. And maybe that's confusing, but I'm just trying to say that there's plenty of people that even when they're eating 20 or 25 grams of carbs will just never, ever see a ketone level of, above a certain amount. And it doesn't mean that the diet isn't working. You can be fat adapted. You can have a fat-based metabolism and just not be registering very high ketones.
Right. And it's so interesting because with ketones are an indicator that there are ketone bodies circulating in the blood from the breakdown of either fat deposits on the body, stored body fat, or fat that's been consumed. And I think just like me, you also have experienced gaining weight in ketosis and having really high ketones. So it doesn't necessarily mean that higher ketones mean that your body is burning more of its stored body fat. But for me, I personally like, if people are going to be measuring, to be looking more for having that consistently low blood glucose levels, low levels of glucose circulating and low concentrations of glucose in the blood, because that to me says a lot more than a person's ketone usage. It can also be different levels of efficiency in terms of how they're using ketones. So to me, having that steady low blood sugar is really what we're looking for, and what we're doing keto for, and what you're doing low carb for is to really be reducing that, higher level of glucose in the blood.
Oh, I totally agree. If you're going to measure anything, measuring blood glucose is probably, a better use of your time and money than to measure your ketones. And if people are going to measure ketones, that's fine, but they have to understand how to interpret the numbers they see. They can't live and die by that ketone number. And if your listeners are familiar with the Virta company, VIRTA, it's a kind of a startup company that's basically using ketogenic and low carb diets to reverse type 2 diabetes. They've done a couple of studies now, but in one of their studies where several of their subjects were able to completely stop their insulin, and again, this is type 2, not type 1 diabetes, obviously, able to completely stop their insulin, get off several of their meds, and the mean ketone level among that cohort was 0.6. And if that was the mean, the average, then a lot of people were lower than that. So that tells us that you don't need a super high ketone level to have the metabolic benefits of this way of eating. What you need is the low glucose and the low insulin. That's the magic of this diet.
Yes.
And with low glucose and insulin, some people will have high ketones, some won't.
Yes, I agree. Now, I'm really curious of your opinion on this, because I first started doing low carb when Atkins was kind of, popular. I'm curious why Atkins didn't really work for me. I personally believe it's because I didn't really have the full understanding of the mechanics behind why low carb was working. So when, I was struggling with weight loss, and then I would read, media headlines or articles or things saying, you really just have to count calories and that's how it all works, and then I would kind of go back to that. But why do you think that Atkins and say Banting, they've been more fads in the past? They've, had their peaks and then people have fallen off them, and now keto's here. But, what is it that made those kind of fall in and out of favor? And, could keto be different from that this time around?
Well, I might have kind of a different perspective on it. Certainly, there were those periods where these low carb diets were like all the rage, and then they disappeared, and then they were all the rage again, and then they disappeared again. I mean, in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, but in my opinion, keto is Atkins. Keto is Banting. It's just a little bit stricter. So I actually think this is the Atkins diet. It's just wrapped up in a new bow. It's wrapped up in a shiny new ribbon, and it's got a shiny new name. Because I'll have people write to me like,
Right.
well, I tried Atkins in the past, but now I really want to do keto. And I'm like, well, they're kind of the same thing, right? So that's honestly what I think is happening. But my fear is that right now, things are very polarized. We've got the meat eaters, we've got the carnivores and the low carbers, and then we've got the plant-based, and I don't like that term because it's plant only. Vegan diets are plant only. They're not plant-based. We've got a very, very
Yes.
vocal, sometimes militant movement of people that want all humans on the planet to stop eating animal foods of all kinds. So hopefully that movement is not going to win out. Hopefully there's enough of us that know the science that will stick up for animal foods. But my fear, and I don't know if this is why low carb or Atkins or Banting, fell out of favor here and there. But we saw this happen with the paleo movement. And when you go to low carb events and seminars, you'll see the vendors selling keto bread and keto cookies and keto muffins and keto this. And don't get me wrong, that stuff can be really helpful when people are struggling to adhere to the diet, to stick to it to the long term. If they're not going to go to the time and effort to make that stuff themselves, because that stuff can be expensive, the almond flour and the erythritol and all these ingredients. Some people would just rather buy a package of keto style bagels. So I'm not saying that those things shouldn't exist, but the movement is going to lose some credibility the more of that stuff we have, instead of people just understanding that it's a protein and vegetables and some fat. I think this time around, though, it has a lot more staying power because there is so much more science. There's so much more hard data in support of this now than there was, in 1972 when Dr. Atkins' first book came out. And even in the 90s when his other versions came out, there's so much more science now that you really cannot even debate the science. There's so many medical doctors, legitimate doctors, not like internet guru type weekend warriors. I mean, there's plenty of us doing that too, but there's just too much science and too much data now proving how effective this is that I just don't think you can deny it.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I know one of the recent studies had over 130,000 people or something that they studied. It was published in the Lancet. I think it was done in McMaster's, possibly in Toronto, and, studying the long-term safety of low carb and showing mortality rates, being much lower in people who are doing low carb. I agree with you. The science is there. For me, understanding the science really made the difference this time around, and understanding the role of insulin, especially as a fat storing and fat burning regulator in the body, and how its presence really, tells the body to be storing fat, and its absence enables us to access that stored body fat. Understanding that alone, and the fact that we could be metabolically flexible, be fat burners, and be primarily fueled from fat versus glucose, all those things really help me to understand why this is effective. And I think a lot of that is because of our community and how supportive it is in spreading and sharing the science behind it. And, I hope that will lend to the longevity of this, having that community there, and having this community that, we can share these things and spread the information there. Now, I have always deterred people personally away from taking exogenous ketone supplements, and I'm curious on your take on them. For me, the average healthy person can produce ketones very easily, from stored body fat if they're in ketosis or doing low carb. And the ketone supplements don't really address the underlying cause of these symptoms that, we have, like say, weight gain or other issues that people are coming to keto for. So to me, it seems like kind of a waste of money, and I've always deterred people away from them, but I'm curious to your take on them.
So kind of like everything else, it's all about context. I agree with you that I don't recommend them to most people, but that's because most people come to me for fat loss or controlling blood sugar. They're not a fat loss tool. They're not a weight loss tool. Where I think they can be the best help is people with neurological conditions that for some reason the central nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord is not getting enough energy. And those issues include Alzheimer's disease. They probably include Parkinson's, possibly ALS, multiple sclerosis. Any of those sort of neurodegenerative conditions seem to respond very nicely to higher ketones, however they're achieved, whether it's from the diet or from the exogenous ketones or both. So I think that those things have a really therapeutic place, but they're not a fat loss tool. Just because you have ketones in your blood doesn't mean your body went through all the favorable physiological changes it takes to produce them. So if you just drink them, yes, you will have ketones, and some people will have maybe sharper cognition, like if they normally have brain fog, they may feel better. And I support whatever works. So if somebody uses the exogenous ketones and they like them and they're happy with however they feel from using them, then use them. I have nothing against people being happy with the results they get. That's the main thing. But I think there's a lot of misleading stuff in the marketing of these things. I think they can be very useful, but they're not appropriate for everybody.
Now, do you find that, seeing as though you wrote this book on Alzheimer's and, ketogenic diets or low carb, do you find that they have applications for people with neurodegenerative conditions or for Alzheimer's?
Are you asking about the exogenous ketones or the diet?
Well, let's talk about the diet first.
Yeah, the diet does help. There's unfortunately, not too many studies have been done using the diet. Most of the studies, at least for Alzheimer's, have used exogenous ketones. But I think that's partly because it's hard to get an older person who's already in the throes of cognitive impairment to stick to a ketogenic diet. It's hard enough for like young people that want to do it, let alone someone in their 70s or 80s who actually doesn't have proper cognitive function. So most of those studies have employed the exogenous, but some have used the diet, and they do notice a little bit of an improvement. What we have more is, I hate this word, but it's anecdotes. It's stories from people whose mother or grandfather, whatever, went on a more ketogenic kind of diet at the best they could, and there was noticeable improvement. I know of a couple of people where the exogenous ketones have been really, really helpful for Parkinson's. Most of the people that I know that started with the exogenous eventually transitioned to the diet, and they still use the exogenous in addition. So I think the ketones help however they're gotten, whether your own body's making them or if you're drinking them in that context, not for like weight loss and diabetes.
Now, Alzheimer's has been talked about as diabetes of the brain. Is that how you look at it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they call it type 3 diabetes now, or diabetes of the brain.
And so it's basically, is it a failure of the brain to receive fuel because it can't uptake the glucose?
Yeah, good question. So the main problem in the Alzheimer's brain is that the neurons have lost the ability to get fuel from glucose. So Alzheimer's really is a metabolic problem. And when I say metabolic, that just means it has to do with the way the brain uses energy. So it's a fuel shortage in the brain, and these neurons basically starve and atrophy. And at first, the brain, in the earlier stages of the disease, the brain still takes up glucose. It's just that the cells don't use it. It just kind of gets in the brain, but the cells don't actually metabolize it. Later in the disease process, the brain actually stops taking it up. It's like, well, if these neurons aren't even going to burn this glucose, we might as well not even take it into the brain. So it's actually a little bit of both.
Wow, that's incredible. And is it similar with Parkinson's?
I haven't looked at the Parkinson's as much as I've looked at Alzheimer's, but it does look like it's a very similar process. It's kind of like an energy thing, and it's just a different. So this might be a little bit radical, but it looks like a lot of these conditions, whether it's MS or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, it's kind of like the same underlying problem. It's just manifesting differently. The symptoms are showing themselves differently because they all have now been shown to have at least some rooting inability to properly fuel these cells. So in Alzheimer's, it's certain neurons in specific parts of the brain that are affected. In Parkinson's, it's some of the dopamine secreting cells, and you get the tremors. In ALS, it's the motor neurons. So ALS, I think, is a slightly different animal. There's a lot less research on that than on the other ones. So I'm not really sure about that. But all of these conditions are, at least in part, coming from an inability of these cells to properly fuel themselves and get energy. And we don't know why. That's kind of still the question. We don't know why that's happening, but that is what's happening.
Right. Well, I mean, if you think of it as diabetes, diabetes in the body, the hyperinsulinemia comes from having, insulin resistance. So could that be a similar process that's happening, that it's just kind of exhausting the cell's abilities to be fueled from glucose?
Yeah, in Alzheimer's, I can say pretty confidently that is what's happening. When you have chronically high insulin, it is a major risk factor for Alzheimer's, regardless of your genetics, regardless of your family history. It is a huge risk factor for this disease. I think the same can be said of Parkinson's. I've seen a little bit of research now connecting hyperinsulinemia to Parkinson's. I can't really speak to the other conditions, but I do think that that's a similar thing. I mean, all of these conditions are becoming much more common than they ever were, just like heart diseases, just like diabetes is, just like PCOS, all these things that may have existed in little pockets here and there, but they're just epidemics now. And so to deny even the possibility that these issues could be driven by diet and lifestyle is, I think we're taking a lot off the table in terms of treatment and therapy by just chasing faulty genes or genetic mutations, or, and not even trying to entertain the possibility that all of these conditions are stemming from a mismatch of our diet and lifestyle, in the same way all these other, like I said, PCOS and cardiovascular disease, all those other sort of new diseases of civilization.
Hey guys, just
as they're
taking
called.
a really quick break to talk about the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. If you're interested in doing a ketogenic diet for yourself, it's a great place to start. I teach you everything about how to follow a keto diet to get yourself into nutritional ketosis, and it includes 28 days of meal plans. It comes with weekly shopping lists, how to interpret results, how to test yourself, a complete guide to getting started on keto. If you've been keto for a while and you're just not getting the results that you want to in terms of your health or fat loss, or you are brand new to keto, the 28-day challenge is a great option because it also comes with my free coaching and support in our members Facebook group, and you can post any questions that you have about the meal plans, about keto, and I am there supporting you. We have an amazing community in our group. I like to call it the happiest place on earth, because everybody in there is so excited about following keto, about having found something that really works well for them. And everyone in there is just so kind, caring, generous, and supportive. And it's a really fun place to be and hang out. So if you like more info on it, you can find it at ketogenicgirl.com. And it's the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. And now back to our interview. I love how Dr. Benjamin Beekman puts it, that all modern non-infectious disease has its root in our metabolic health. It's amazing to see that these epidemics, exploding. Now, what inspired you to write your book?
I did my graduate thesis on this topic, on Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes and the potential therapeutic use of ketogenic diets. And when I finished, I said to myself, I can't keep this to myself. I think this is genuinely life-saving, life-changing information. Like, I can't just let this thing sit on my laptop and no one's ever going to know. Because when I was doing the research, I couldn't believe that, I had been eating low carb for over 10 years by the time I was getting this degree. And I couldn't believe that for as long as I was low carbing and as long as I had been reading about it and learning about it, I had never heard of this connection between glucose and insulin and Alzheimer's until I read Gary Taubes' book, Good Calories, Bad Calories. That's the first place I ever heard about this. So I said, oh my God, if I've known about low carb and keto for so long and I've never heard of this, then probably the people out there who have Alzheimer's and their loved ones and caregivers, there's no way they've ever heard of this. Why isn't this everywhere? People should be shouting this from the rooftops. The Alzheimer's Association should be all over this. And instead, we have total silence. We have crickets. So I said, I have to make this into a book. Like I have to get this information to the people who need it the most. So I started it as this little PDF ebook that my friend helped me with. And I was very fortunate in that a publishing company approached me to make it into a quote unquote real book. I mean, I didn't have to do a book proposal or anything. They just wanted to publish it. So that's why I wrote it, just because I couldn't imagine that here we are. The scientific literature is full of this. Type 3 diabetes, brain insulin resistance, glucose problem in the brain. It's not disputed. That is an indisputable fact of this illness. That's the first thing that people should be told upon receiving a diagnosis. Hey, by the way, this disease is because your brain is starving to death because it can't use glucose. We don't know why that's happening, but we know what to do about it. And the thing to do about it is to give that brain some ketones.
Right. Now that's amazing. And I'm, congratulations on writing the book, because I feel like everyone should know this. It seems like we all talk about it so much, but we're in this low carb community. And yet you could say this to someone on the street and they might still look at you like you're nuts. They might just completely discredit what you're saying and say, well, no, that's, there's no way Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or these conditions can be treated with a diet. They might still laugh at that. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in kind of spreading the message. So, congratulations on writing that and contributing to the dialogue and awareness.
Thanks. Thank you. I just hope people find it helpful. My fear is that, kind of like you said, we're in this bubble where we all kind of know about this already, that I'm preaching to the choir. I mean, the people that I wish would read my book are the people that have never, ever heard of this concept, or that have never tried a low carb diet, never heard the phrase type 3 diabetes. And I just don't know that they're ever going to come across it.
Now, one thing I saw that was fascinating, it was several years ago, and I don't know if it was in something that was an extract from your book actually or something, but it showed some trials where they had Alzheimer's patient. They had one in particular that was taking MCT oil or coconut oil, and he was doing these daily drawings of clocks that looked kind of all misshapen and the numbers were all over the place. And then as he was doing the drawings over time, it started to look more like a clock with a round face and the numbers in order. And it just blew me away to see something like that. So is that kind of how the treatment is being done, or what are some of the trials that are being conducted, and how is the research progressing?
That was Steve Newport. That's Mary Newport's husband. And she's a physician who, her husband had this very severe Alzheimer's, and she knew about the medium chain triglycerides, the MCTs, because she was a neonatologist. She worked with preemies, and she knew that the MCTs were really good for the baby's brain and the baby's nervous system. So she started giving her husband coconut oil to see if it would have any effect on his brain, and it did. And like I said, there's those clock drawings. People can find those on the internet, so I'm sure he had a noticeable improvement with getting some coconut oil. And then she moved on to giving him MCT and then exogenous ketones. He unfortunately has lost his life. He's no longer with us, but the last couple of years of his life, I think his quality of life and hers were vastly improved because of the ketones. I'm not sure where the research is going right now in terms of clinical trials with ketones, but I know there's more and more research coming out all the time showing not only that ketones can restore some degree of healthy cognition in people with Alzheimer's and impairment, the precursor to Alzheimer's. Thankfully, there's more and more research coming out questioning the amyloid hypothesis. So Alzheimer's treatment has centered around going after this one particular protein that has been implicated in causing the disease, except there's a lot of controversy surrounding that hypothesis, and every single drug that's in this category of drugs has been a failure. It's had no impact on the disease, and thankfully now that's where the research is headed, hopefully, is away from that and more promising therapies, including ketogenic diets. And thank goodness, the research has not been done only in mice and only in cultured neurons, but in human subjects with Alzheimer's disease. So that's really, I think there's a lot of moving parts, and I'm not trying to oversimplify the way this works, but certainly for whatever reason, the Alzheimer's brain doesn't use glucose effectively, but it still uses ketones. And an older person who has severe dementia, their brain is not going to use ketones as well as a younger person's brain, but they still use them.
Right. So is doing a low carb diet for someone who has Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or neurodegenerative conditions in their family, would going on a low carb diet be something that they could do preventatively?
If somebody wants to do a very low carb or ketogenic diet, certainly they can. I think that probably is a very good, again, potential protective strategy, but I don't think everyone has to do that. What you do have to do is keep your blood glucose and your insulin levels within a healthy range. And the amount of carbohydrate that somebody can consume and still achieve that goal is going to differ. Some of us are going to have to be at 30 grams a day. Some people could be at 150 grams a day. It really just depends on the individual person's tolerance. I think a low carb, some type of carbohydrate restriction is probably the best way to go, but the degree of the restriction is going to differ. Not really. I mean, it may be the case that just because of their larger size, men have a higher carbohydrate tolerance, but look at the millions of men out there with type 2 diabetes and hyperinsulinemia. I don't think that's necessarily any different.
Now, if someone has a family member with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, or they're just interested in learning more about this, where would your book be a good place for them to start?
My book is specific to Alzheimer's, but I do think a lot of it is applicable to any ketogenic diet, because the first section of my book is all about Alzheimer's. The whole rest of the book is how to implement a ketogenic or low carb diet, what to eat, what not to eat, dispelling the myths about saturated fat and cholesterol being harmful, dispelling the myths about red meat being harmful. So that applies to anybody. Mary Newport has a book that I haven't had a chance to read yet. Her book is, I think it's called The Coconut Oil Solution, something like that, something about coconut oil. And it's, she talks more about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and the other neurodegenerative conditions. So that might be a good place for people to start too. But I think my book is a really good guide as to how to do a low carb diet, especially for people that are new, that have never tried one before.
Now, speaking of those two myths, what are some of your favorite keto myths that you like dispelling?
Oh, well, God, there's so many.
Right.
I mean, with the specific, because of the clients that come to me, my favorite myth is probably that you can just eat as much fat as you want, as long as your carbs are low, it's unlimited fat, or that you have to have a certain percentage of fat in your diet. I think the proof that that's wrong is all the people we see that are doing a very, very high fat intake and are not losing weight. If that's their goal, they're not losing body fat. But yeah, around the food, I guess, I don't know what's my favorite. I mean, I feel like some of what would have been my favorites 10 years ago are just kind of debunked already. Are people still afraid of saturated fat? I don't know. Maybe they are, but
I think the general population is still afraid of cholesterol, and especially consuming a lot of like meat and nitrates in foods and things.
yeah.
That's probably maybe going to take more time, but it's thanks to, work that you're doing and other people are doing to spread the message.
Since you mentioned the cholesterol, one of the, not just my favorite myths, but one of the most important myths to debunk, because I get clients that are still terrified of high cholesterol. If their total cholesterol is high or their LDL is high, there's so much research now that basically total cholesterol is almost meaningless. And I'm not saying it's 100% meaningless, but the amount of cholesterol in your bloodstream tells you zero about the amount of atherosclerosis, the amount of calcified plaque in your arteries, period. And if people are following Dave Feldman's work at cholesterolcode.com, the research he's doing is like mind-blowing. He's busting these myths left and right, slaying all these sacred cows, where we have some people in arguably the greatest health and physical condition of their lives. They have extremely high LDL and zero signs of atherosclerosis. When they have the test done that actually measures the calcification in their arteries, it's zero. You can have, super, super high LDL, but their insulin is extremely low. The glucose is low. The triglycerides are low. Everything else looks really good. So again, I'm not saying that high cholesterol or high LDL is always meaningless or not a sign of anything bad, but we really have to rethink everything. And I get a lot of people that will come to me even within low carb. Well, my doctor said my cholesterol is high. And I'm like, all right, so what?
Right. As long as your triglycerides and your, A1C are looking nice and low, it's amazing. You always see that consistently with people who go low carb, that those levels, measurably go down, quite consistently across most people.
Yeah. I mean, the numbers are not always meaningless, but it's, are we looking at the right numbers and are we interpreting them in the right way?
Right. Now, for someone, who is looking to burn fat, I think one thing that's interesting is we talked already about lowering your fat intake, but just because you're lowering it doesn't mean that you're now going back to zero fat or that you're not still on a high fat diet. You can do a high fat diet, but maybe having 2 tablespoons of dressing or mayonnaise instead of, 6 or 7 can make a huge difference. And I like to recommend that to people usually when they're at a stall, is just to try and reduce some of the dietary fat that they're taking in, until they get to their goal. And then, adding back in like keto coffees or, a little bit more mayo or butter, these kinds of things when they're in maintenance. What are some of the things that you advise people, when they're going on a low carb diet for fat loss? Do you have any specific macros? I know you basically just tell them to reduce the carbohydrate intake.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you brought this up because I sort of alluded to this a little earlier when I was saying when I tell people, just because you're on a ketogenic diet doesn't mean you can eat unlimited fat. I have to explain to them that, again, like, I'm not trying to make them afraid of fat. This is still a high fat diet, but a lot of people come to me with, oh, well, this is the macro that I got from the calculator. And it's always, 80% fat, 75 to 85% fat. And if they're not getting results, if we can bring them down to like 60, 65% fat, that's still a really high fat diet. You're still getting
Right.
65% of your calories from fat, but maybe the difference is now you're getting 25 or 30% from protein, whereas before it was 10 or 12% protein, maybe 15%. So that's the thing. It's not when you cut back fat on a low carb diet, it doesn't become a low fat diet. It just becomes lower in fat than it was before, but it's still, like I said, 60, 65% fat, So no, I don't give people macros. I'm not opposed to the numbers, but I think those numbers, macros, grams and stuff can be a good starting point, but the whole, in my opinion anyway, the beauty of eating this way is that you shouldn't have to count anything. That was in the past. That was when we all did calorie counting and point counting and the cabbage soup diet. That was in the past. This is a diet that should, at least in theory, free us from the prison of the math. Tracking everything, weighing everything, measuring everything. When the blood sugar normalizes and the insulin normalizes, your appetite, we should be allowed and able to trust our appetite. If you're hungry, eat. If you're not hungry, don't eat. Don't eat by the clock because it's noon and you think you're supposed to have lunch. If you're not hungry, don't eat. But if you are hungry, don't force yourself to fast. Eat something if you're hungry. So I don't like giving numbers because I think the beauty of this diet is that you should be able to eat without that. Now, but that being said, yeah, if somebody's not getting the results they want, then you do kind of have to track because you have to see where you are. You can't change anything unless you know where you're coming from. So when people are brand new, I don't advise them to count anything. It just adds an extra layer of difficulty onto this that doesn't need to be there.
I agree with that. And you just want to make it as simple as possible. And there's something about low carb and keto where I've always feel this sense of ease, especially when we're on a holiday where I know if I'm just doing, bacon and eggs and I'm not having, the crepes and the waffles and, donuts maybe I would have had in the past on holiday. I'm just having that low carb approach that it really helps you get to a place of intuitive eating. It may not be that way at first, which is why having some guidelines and things can be helpful. Also, I'm in the same mind with you with, the carb replacement foods and breads and sweeteners and things. I think they're a great tool, especially when you're first making the transition from a diet that is so high carb and low fat that going off of them completely and eliminating them completely from your diet can be kind of shocking. And I needed those things, to help me make the transition, but then eliminating them. And over time, you sort of start to tune in more to your body and those hunger signals and that fullness, those fullness indicators, and you start to tune in more to when you're hungry and when you're not. But it does take time at the beginning. So having some of those tools and things can just help at the start as well. I'm curious what your take is on moderating protein while still prioritizing it.
The funny thing is, in the Atkins induction phase, which was pretty much the most effective, simplest way to lose body fat, protein was unlimited. And I think that's probably going to surprise people. Beef, pork, chicken, fish, provided there was no breading and no fillers that contain starch, just whole, unprocessed meat, whatever, unlimited. So for most people, I don't know where this protein fear came from, but it has to die. Most people will not consume, quote unquote, too much protein, if that's even a thing. As long as you're not slamming protein powders and eating bars and shakes all day. If you're eating regular food, nobody's going to overconsume protein. However, what I've heard, I haven't seen this too much, but what I've heard from people with personal experience, and I have no reason to doubt them, is that if people have very, very severe hyperinsulinemia or diabetes, and it's not reversing itself as quickly as they thought or as well as they would expect on a low carb or ketogenic diet with a relatively high protein intake, sometimes they do need to go a little bit lower in protein, at least for some period of time, until their metabolism is corrected and until they're a little healthier, and then they can start to reintroduce more protein. And it's not low protein, but it's just lower than maybe they were doing. So again, I hate to be so wishy-washy, but I just support whatever works. If somebody tells me, hey, I was 300 pounds and the weight wasn't budging, I cut back a little on protein and things started to move, then great. Okay. But I see far more often people majorly skimping on protein. So I tend to encourage a higher protein intake. Not high, not like crazy high, but just high normal.
Right. And I think it's great that people like Dr. Benjamin Beekman have done research showing that high amounts of protein can spike insulin, but that's on a standard American diet or high carb diet, whereas on a low carb diet, it doesn't have the same effect on insulin. So, you can prioritize protein, make sure that you get all of your nutrient needs met. Now, what would you say is your main message right now? And what are you kind of most excited about in this space?
That's a good, my main message. I don't know. And now I sound dumb because I don't have an answer ready.
Well, I also like to say, if you could put something on a billboard out there for everyone to see, like, what would it say?
What would I say? Just keep carbs low. That would be my billboard. No, but really, I mean, I've always prided myself on being a voice of reason and sanity and logic. And I think I feel that way now more than ever because of the craziness that I see in some of these keto Facebook groups and various forums where everybody's so, like, you can literally feel the anxiety radiating out of the computer and radiating out of the phone. People driving themselves crazy over their ketone levels, or they're going over their protein macro, or just all this stuff. And it never used to be this way. It never used to be this complicated. It never used to be this confusing. And so I just try to bring people back to the most important, most effective things, which is eating very low carb and eating mostly whole, real food that doesn't contain a lot of weird junk. Although, I'd be lying if I said I didn't eat some of that stuff. I mean, I do. But I just try to remind people how simple this is when you let it be.
I love that. I love that you're a voice of reason. It's really important to, have that, especially, when there are these kind of keto groups and things. I'm not part of a lot of them online, so I haven't seen a lot of that, but I do notice that people do get very intense and anxious about, not failing at getting the right levels and things. And it's just another measure, like stepping on the scale, that's, a tool for people to use, whether they're measuring up or not, literally. And I love that you have a very simple message of just eating real food and, keeping it low carb. And that's, really going to make a big difference. Now, just as we wind things up, I have some fast talk. I'm going to ask you some quick rapid fire questions, and you can just pick one or the other. Salad or steak?
Steak.
Fasting or no fasting?
It depends on how you define fasting. So I'm going to say no fasting because It depends on how you define it. I'm going to say no.
Okay. Maybe I'll say time restricted eating or no time restricted eating.
Time restricted eating. Yes.
Testing or no testing?
For ketones, no testing.
Carb ups or no carb ups?
No carb ups.
Supplements or no supplements?
Supplements.
Advocate or silent follower?
Oh, of who? I don't know. That depends on who.
The keto kind of low carb.
I guess I'm an advocate. I can't pretend I'm not after this podcast, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Grass fed or grain fed?
Whatever you can afford.
Yes, absolutely. Rare, medium rare, well done.
Medium rare.
Nice.
If anyone ever said well done, you have to kick them off the show.
That'll be my rule. Fried, baked, steamed, or grilled?
Baked.
Possibility of eating high carb again in the future, possible or never?
Higher than keto levels, yes. Quote unquote high, no.
Keto for life or for a few more years?
Low carb for life.
Now, where can people find more from you? What can people look out for from you next? And what keeps you busy these days?
Yeah, my website is tuitnutrition.com, TUIT nutrition.com. My book is called The Alzheimer's Antidote, and that's on Amazon. Right now, I do a lot of writing in the health and nutrition world. I have a couple of blog posts coming up later this summer on a new look at insulin and the pathology of diabetes, which hopefully will be really educational for people. Other than that, I'm speaking in Roxborough, North Carolina on September 22nd. People can search for ADAPT North Carolina. They'll find that event. Speaking about Alzheimer's in Houston in October. They can search Low Carb Houston. And that's it for now.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast and for all the work that you're doing, especially with regards to Alzheimer's and spreading the word, and the contributions you make being, a voice of reason in the space. It's really appreciated, and really appreciate all your contributions, Amy.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we met on the cruise, right? It was great to meet you in person.
Yeah, it was really good to connect with you, and looking forward to catching you at some future events. And
all right, thanks. Take care.
Looking out for more of those blog posts. They sound fantastic.
Thank you.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Amy Berger. She is a wealth of knowledge on Alzheimer's, and be sure to go check out her book, The Alzheimer's Antidote, using a low-carb, high-fat diet to fight Alzheimer's disease, memory loss, and cognitive decline. And she blogs at tuitnutrition.com. That's TUIT nutrition.com, and I'll be sure to put that in the show notes as well. It was such a pleasure having Amy on today. She certainly is a voice of reason in the keto space and has so much great knowledge and information to share. So I'll be looking forward to checking out those blog posts that she mentioned. If you are interested in trying out the ketogenic diet and not sure where to start, check out the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. It is available at ketogenicgirl.com. It comes with 28 days of meal plans, so you can just get past all of the information overwhelm and get started. It also comes with shopping lists and all the information you need if you're interested in testing for ketones, testing your blood sugar. I teach you how to interpret results, and it also comes with my support and coaching as well. So I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. Until the next one, have a fat-fueled rest of your week.